At Trinity University, our history is what guides us, and it is what shapes our future. It is what ignites our spirit for innovation, for discovery, for creation, and our drive to be noticed, to make a difference, to lead. This is Trinity University. Discover, grow, become.
Good evening. I'm Danny Anderson, president of Trinity University, and it is an honor to welcome you to the 2018 Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorative Lecture. Since its inaugural program more than 20 years ago, this lecture has featured prominent civil rights leaders, authors, and artists. The lecture honors the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. By way of this lecture, the City of San Antonio and Trinity University celebrate a partnership. This partnership allows us to commemorate King's legacy within the Trinity community and within the San Antonio community as well. This is a very special year for the City of San Antonio's MLK Jr. Commission. On January 19, 1987, the Commission and the City of San Antonio held its first Martin Luther King Jr. March. Each year, a variety of educational, inspirational, and celebratory events honor one of the nation's most revered civil rights leaders. This year, the Commission celebrates the 50th anniversary of the largest march in the nation. Please join me in applause to congratulate the Commission. Before we welcome Kathleen Cleaver to the podium, I want to describe the format for the evening. After the lecture, there will be a brief time for questions and answers, about 20 minutes. And as we end the near of the question and answer period, I will rise to call for the last question. If you want to pose a question, please keep it brief and specific so that we can hear the response from our guest. There is a microphone to the right in the auditorium that is reserved for questions from Trinity University students, and to the left is open to anyone in attendance tonight. It is now my pleasure to introduce Yvette Pena, a Trinity senior from McAllen, Texas, who will introduce our guest speaker. Yvette is a psychology major who has participated in faculty-led research for 2 years. After graduation, Yvette plans to pursue a career in education policy. Her work with the Learning Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and with Casa Raíces here in San Antonio has sparked a passion for human rights, which she hopes to continue throughout her career. Please welcome Yvette Pena.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Good evening. I am honored to have the opportunity to introduce Trinity's 2018 Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorative Lecturer speaker, Kathleen Cleaver, a human rights advocate and senior lecturer and research fellow at Emory University School of Law. Kathleen Cleaver has made and continues to make a tremendous impact in the world of Black rights. I was first introduced to her work earlier this year when I wrote a paper on her 1968 remarks on why Black people were beginning to wear their hair in natural styles. In this interview, she stated that the reason was a newfound awareness that Black people were beginning to realize that their own natural and physical appearance is beautiful and pleasing to them. She put into words what so many people felt about the rising Black is Beautiful movement. Even 50 years after they were spoken, these words resonated so strongly with me and deeply inspired me. I am not alone in my admiration for Cleaver's message. Her work continuously educates and inspires people in a wide variety of topics. It wasn't until this paper that I realized the scope of the impact she's made in dedicating her life to the human rights struggle. From 1967 to 1971, she served as the communications secretary of the Black Panther Party and was the first female member of their Central Committee. After years of exile in Algeria and France, where she co-founded the international wing of the Black Panther Party, she returned to the United States in late 1975. In 1992, she joined the faculty at Emory University Law School and dedicated her time to challenging racial injustices. She went on to serve as a board member of the Southern Center for Human Rights and taught in various universities, including Yale University, Sarah Lawrence College, and the University of Texas Law School. Since 2000, she has served as the co-director of the Human Rights Research Fund, part of a network of anti-racist organizations that document violations of human rights in the United States. Today, she continues to dedicate her life to the human rights struggle, both nationally and internationally, educating people on topics ranging from natural hair to racial injustice. I'm thrilled we have the opportunity to listen to her speak tonight. Please help me in welcoming Kathleen Cleaver to the podium tonight.
Thank you. I wish I could see you better, but the light is in my eyes and the shadows over you. But it looks like a lively and interested group of people, and I'm very pleased to be invited to Trinity College. I didn't really know much about Trinity, but I knew that something about the Trinity. There's other colleges that are Trinity, that are called that, and I realized this is not connected to them, but this is a very serious kind of university with a long mission and a very, what's the right word? Well-developed, well-thought-out educational program, which means people who graduate from this school actually are in a position to make a difference. So I really appreciate being part of your Martin Luther King commemoration. What I want to talk about is the concept of refresh, resist, and resume. Refresh your energy, resist the desire to give up, resist oppression, and resume the struggle. This really is more for people who are younger as opposed to grandparents like me. We didn't quit. So we want some more people to come in and resume. But it is a delight to be at your college. It's so, first of all, it's a beautiful place. But secondly, the students I've seen are so lively. They're intellectually lively. It's clear to me that Trinity College is doing something that really works, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the contribution that your graduates are going to make to the world that they've inherited. I can't explain what you've inherited, but I do expect that you will make some improvements. So when I say refresh, I mean refresh energies that people need to continue to make change. And in America, this is something we actually believe and do. There are many countries in which you could desire to make change. For example, I lived in Paris, France for about 4 years. You could desire to make change. Yeah, and they'll tell you, well, we've been doing X since the 17th century, and we've been doing this since the 11th century. And so it's like complex. The concept of change is very different in an ancient world. And then before I went to France, I was living in North Africa, and it felt even more ancient. And change comes very, very, very slowly in a North African culture. So it's exciting to be back in America. It's exciting to be in a country where people constantly are aware of change. Now, some people resist it. Some people want to go back to the time before the prevalence of integration, like the person who's sitting up there in the White House, who appropriated the White House. Personally, I think he's the wrong person. But he got elected. And it may be his election that helped stimulate a lot more opposition to the kinds of negative behaviors and negative events and negative messages that we are getting now, I don't think that he's widely agreed with, but he's accepted. That's what we have, an electoral system. You win the votes, you're accepted. I mean, you're there. So when I say refresh, what I want people to do is have the confidence, which young people gain, and the desire to return to a form of struggle that emphasizes what's really important: social justice, human rights, human dignity, health. So those who are committed to those goals, I suggest that your commitment be refreshed, and I suggest that people resist the oppressive entities, the repressive moves, the repressive laws that we see on the horizon or in place. I mean, every time I turn on CNN, there's something more negative than there was the day before that is identified as the desire of the president. I think the last headline I saw was about DACA. You know, so why is someone, I mean, you have to wonder what kind of person wants to deny and eliminate the value of young people who can contribute to this country because of their immigration status. That's incoherent, particularly in a country as big as this, and a country that was known when I was growing up as a nation of immigrants. And so for those of you who are young, or those of you who are college freshmen and college sophomore, I'm encouraging you to study and learn to resume an active social struggle. There are many different ways of doing it. One of them is what you're doing with your Martin Luther King ceremony, studying, but also acknowledging that this is a country that you belong to and it belongs to you. And what happens to it is in your hands, collectively. And therefore, when you're young, ambitious, idealistic, and have a lot of energy, this is your chance to actually do something, to make this country the way you think it should be. Because if someone sees you doing it, and they say, well, she's doing that, I know her, I can do it too. So that's how the movement I was part of. I would see students doing things. What entranced me, and I was growing up, I was in high school, was seeing 3 young black women in the back of a paddy wagon in Albany, Georgia, being hauled off to jail. Why? Because they had demonstrated against segregation in Albany, Georgia, and what struck me, I was a high school student in Pennsylvania, struck me seeing this photograph in the newspaper, they were sitting and they're singing. They were singing on their way to jail. I didn't know until many, many years later that where they were taken was a former prisoner of war camp. It was a horrible place they were taken to, and people didn't even know where they were. And so the kinds of trauma, the kinds of dangers, the kind of maltreatment that the young people who were part of the civil rights movement had to endure should not have been wasted. And many changes were made, maybe not enough. And what happens when one generation makes changes, another generation likes to undo them. The generation that I was a part of, which was the generation they call of the 60s, of the Vietnam War, of the women's movement, of the Black Power movement, we were about changing the world. That was our mantra. We want to change the world collectively. And because at that era, this country was in the turmoil of the war in Vietnam, and thousands of young men were being shipped off to fight in Vietnam, this idea of changing the world was not fanciful. There was one concept at that era that said, well, if I have to die in Vietnam, I don't want to do that. I'd rather stay right here and fight for freedom. And so then there were those who did go to Vietnam and realized that's not what they wanted to do and came back and fought for freedom. One of those people was a young man named Geronimo Pratt, who was in the Army and came back from the military, ultimately joined the Black Panther Party and became a freedom fighter. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but what I was getting at is at that era of radical transformation, the Vietnam War, the women's movement, that there were many young people who took it upon themselves to take responsibility for what was happening in this society and devote their lives to changing it. Some of them survived and some of them didn't, but they left a legacy for this country to say, well, when things get really out of hand, and they were in the war in Vietnam era, when they get really out of hand, you have to stand up, take charge, and turn it back around. That's what I call resume. Resume the struggle. We had a movement against sexual oppression, against gender oppression, against many forms of exclusion. We were more anxious to be liberated personally, liberated sexually, liberated intellectually, and so we fought for freedom consciously so that we would have the full access of our energies to make the world what we wanted it to be. That's what we were all this mantra. We want to change the world. We want to change the world. I was giving a talk at University of Chicago maybe 4 years ago, and I was saying something similar to this. They said, we wanted to change the world. And this lady came up to me and said, you did. So I was very, very impressed. I'm not quite sure it stayed changed. And so you have the opportunity. It still needs changing. It still needs caring. It still needs transformation. And that's the work of young people. They need to pick up the challenge, and you can get assistance, advice, and encouragement from my generation. During the 1960s, when the Vietnam War was being perpetrated, there was also a tremendous impression made in our communities and black communities by the liberation movements and the success of freedom fights in Africa. And we would see countries that had been European on the map, they had been painted the color of England or France or whatever, becoming independent. And we'd see leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, very elegant and proud African leaders in a world that never had seen anything like that. So young people were terribly impressed. I'm not quite sure how everyone felt about the rise of African leadership and African power. It was very controversial in some cases, particularly in a place like the Congo, when Patrice Lumumba became the first African head of state, and it didn't last very long. He was soon murdered. So, but that made us know that this world that we were in was a world in which Africans should be able to change their country, and that we as Americans should be able to change our country, and we put a lot of energy into making that happen. I think it's complex and difficult for younger people of this day to understand what liberation meant to us, what the liberation movements were, and how significant it was and transformative for the people in a country dominated by Europeans, controlled by Europeans, to push that all aside and take their independence. Because now, that's the old history. So now, it's like a country like South Africa, it's tremendously wealthy, tremendously powerful, that was the bastion of white supremacy when I was growing up. When I was growing up, my father was a Foreign Service officer, and he worked for the American agency, what is it, AID. I can't remember exactly what that meant, but thank you, Agency for International Development. And when he was in Africa or Asia, he would work in those projects, and then he'd come back. And one time he was back in the United States, and he was asked to take a group of South Africans on a tour of Atlanta. They were visitors, and the State Department asked him to do this. And one of the visitors from South Africa, when he saw Atlanta, and this is in the late 50s, he said, "This is it. This is what we want. This is apartheid." I live in Atlanta, so thank God that's gone. But it's disturbing that a South African will come all the way to Georgia and see the perfect version of what they're trying to do in South Africa. Well, it's a little difficult because the Africans are the majority, unlike in Georgia. But, so I'd like you to pay attention to the struggles of the past and the struggles of the present, because they're linked. The issues of human dignity and the end of human suffering, and the ability of people to have access to the resources so they can be educated, so they can make a difference, so they can continue to improve the condition of life for the more and more people. And the resources to do that are here. And then the obstacles to that are here. And so the question is, what's going to win? The obstacles or the energy of people who actually know they need to make a difference, the world can be better, and we need to release the energies of the generation that is in position to change things more so than we have. At one point I was in Chicago, and this woman, I said, we wanted to change the world, and she said, well, you did. And I was somewhat stunned, because it seems to me that a lot of the things we wanted to change, they made it change for a while, but none of them came back. And so there's a reaction. And however, we don't start from the backward level we were in the 1950s when King's struggle got started. But so one of the slogans, or one of the ideas that I find very appealing, is dare to struggle. Dare to struggle, because there's another part to it. What is it? Dare to win. And so many people feel intimidated. Oh, how could we do anything? Well, what is it that we could do? And if we do anything, they're going to stop being demoralized. That's the tool of your opponent, to keep you demoralized. Be energized. Be positive. Use your imagination. It doesn't cost anything to use your imagination. It might cost something if you get arrested and you have to pay bail to get out, but it doesn't cost anything to use your imagination. But you have to make that choice. I think this is an environment, and this university is the kind of place in which you're conditioned to be able to think that way. It's safe to think that way. It's a good thing to think that way. And I'm honored to be here to be part of your Martin Luther King ceremony. I was fortunate enough to meet Martin Luther King when I was in Atlanta. I was on the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Martin Luther King traveled quite a bit. But one Sunday he spoke at his church, and Stokely Carmichael, who was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at that time, took a group of us to the church, and we sat all together in a row, and we listened to what King said that Sunday. And I think it was the Sunday right before he went up to New York and made his anti-war declaration. Anyway, he invited Stokely and the group that was with him to his home for dinner. And it just sticks in my mind. It was a wonderful moment. His wife didn't actually sit at the table with us, so it was Dr. King and all these people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and most of the conversation was Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King. And he made the comment, oh, Dr. King, you used to really like those peppers, because he kept eating the peppers with his supper, or with the lunch, and he said, all revolutionaries like hot peppers. Well, I was very impressed. We're in the same camp. We can't return to the past. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we can't return to the past, but we can study the past, and we can learn from things that happened before we were born or happened during the lives of our parents, and take out from that what we can use in a sheltered and very, very powerfully, what's the right word? This is a wealthy, beautiful, charming, sheltered space, Trinity College. The world is not like this. But when you have the opportunity to study and learn and develop your talents in this kind of environment, that's a distinct advantage, because you can dream dreams and establish goals and come up with big ideas before they're dashed, before you're persuaded that this can never happen. So you have to hold up the belief that you can change the world. There are people who want to change it for the worse. So you have to be with the angels who want to change it for the better. We have an amazing congestion, a collective of communities in America, in Texas in particular, So look at the skills and the languages and the experiences that people bring to the American community from Mexico, from South America, from Canada, from England, from Africa, even from Alabama and Georgia. We have a tremendously diverse, excited, and able group of people in this country, and we should be able to get going more than we are. But I think the current atmosphere of the current administration of the government is demoralizing. I think they're demoralized themselves because they can't get done exactly what they want. But it's very demoralizing to see, what's the right word, the enshrinement of values of white supremacy so far up in the White House. This is very demoralizing, particularly after the Obama family left. But I guess it should not be surprising. So I think we should dare to struggle, dare to challenge racism. That was one of our slogans, dare to struggle, dare to win, in the 70s. The 70s was a very bloody time. Music was amazing. There was a lot of sexual experimentation, gender experimentation, wild music, and a lot of, what's the right word, inspiration to do things in a creative way, and a lot of that has been deflated, in my opinion. Not that it was wrong, but that there was a conservative reaction and a pushing down, and there are young people here who can't believe that what they dream and what they want, they actually might be able to achieve. They're discouraged and feeling sort of empty and maybe powerless. Don't do that. Collect, make groups, come together, discuss things, decide what you want to do. You can make little changes, and eventually a whole lot of little changes turn up to big changes, and what do you know? You might even be changed. You might be changed in how you think and what you want to do. And that's how social justice is perpetuated. And when you don't do any of those things, when you just let the outsiders control everything, oh, what can I do? I'm just one person. Oh, I don't know how I could do anything. Well, I can't make a difference. When you're demoralized, depressed, and inactive, then they win. And they know it. And so that's what I'm trying to say. Remember the struggles that were successful, refresh your energy, and let's retread, resume, and recognize in yourselves and in your goals that there is the opportunity to make them happen. And that doesn't happen that quickly. And they might not all happen. But you have to return to the conviction that you and your friends and your organizations and your parents can make a difference. You can, in fact, change the world. And I've been demoralized about that thought myself, like, oh, well, what can we do? But it can be done. It needs to be done. There's so many people who are depending on it, and when they see the opportunity to participate, they can join. So I'm very pleased to know that here in San Antonio, you have the world's biggest Martin Luther King Day March. Thank you. Thank you. It's not in Atlanta, it's in San Antonio. And I'm encouraged to come to a campus such as this in which the teachers here are quite young compared to me. I mean, they like my son. My son is in his 40s. My daughter's in her 40s. So those are my children. So to see that generation as teachers and as leaders in this kind of educational environment is inspiring. I think you're highly fortunate. You're highly fortunate to be in this environment, and I'm sure you all know that. But I would encourage you to resume activism, to study activism, to collect, make small groups, make small plans. This is how movements grow. The Black Panther Party, which many of you probably have heard about, it was started with two men. One was a law student, his name was Huey Newton. The other was a veteran of US military and an engineer and many other things named Bobby Seale. And the two of them came together. They met at college. They met at Merritt College, which is a junior college in Oakland, California. Both were residents of Oakland, and they met there, and they became friends in an organization called the Soul Students. And eventually they created an organization called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense based on their platform and program. They outlined what it would be, the two men, and then they went to Oakland and began to organize it, and people came and joined them. So these things do happen. They're not dreams, it's not impossible, but the timing of when they did it, which was during Vietnam, and the fact that they were so young, energetic, and prepared. One was a law student, Bobby Seale was a veteran, and he was doing a degree at, so people who are prepared, who have the capacity, who have the vision, will generate change if all the other conditions enable their organizations to build. Look at Martin Luther King. He was a graduate of a very prestigious seminary, and he came to Montgomery, Alabama, to be the preacher of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. But Alabama was involved in a social justice struggle. I'm from Alabama. I remember going on demonstrations. Well, I remember we challenged segregation. Well, at least my parents did, and I rode in the car. We had boycotts of all the businesses in Tuskegee, which wasn't a very big town. But when the black community, which was in Tuskegee, which was a college community, boycotted the town, well, their stores began to go out of business. And what we would do is have carpools that would take everyone that could go to Montgomery or go to Atlanta to buy things, to deprive the town of Tuskegee for many resources. So that was a nonviolent protest. It was a very effective protest. I was told about 300 stores went out of business, and I'm not quite sure how many of them came back into business. But the notion that you have to, first of all, you have to believe that it is justified, and you have to believe you can change things, and that's the first step. Because if they get you to think, oh, it won't make a difference, I can't make a difference, things can't be changed, then you're defeated already. You haven't even started. You defeated yourself before you even walked out the door onto a picket line. But I encourage young people because they have more energy and also more vision of what can happen in the future. So I encourage you as students, as teachers, as parents, to really look at the ways in which you see the ability to make change. You see an avenue for change. Help those that you see doing it. Change in the good ways. There's all kind of change, and we had a big change in the White House recently, but that's not my idea of change. That's what we call going backwards. And there are people who want to go backwards. There seems to be millions of them, for a matter of fact. Now, just because they want to doesn't mean they should be entitled to. And I think America is a country of the future. Americans are taught to look to the future. I've lived in other countries that don't have that mindset, particularly France. You know, they're always talking about the 17th century and the 18th century and the 19th. I mean, you walk around in Paris, where I lived for about 4 years, there are streets that were made by Romans that you're walking on when you go to the fish market. It's a very, very ancient time, ancient place, and when you live in that kind of place, you get the sense that it's very hard to change, and it probably is. This is America. America is fundamentally about change. This is Texas. Texas is definitely about change. Maybe not all the good change, but it's a place where change is not illegal. And education in this particular university is extremely sophisticated. So when you have the ideas, you have the opportunity, the society needs you, I would encourage those of you who have the time and the resources as young people to participate in activities that bring about social benefits and social change. You may not be able to do that your entire life, but doing it will change you. It will educate you, it will empower you, and then you will educate and empower other people around you. And that's what I mean when I say remember what happened, refresh your energy, and reload, get up and get moving, because we're at a moment, I think we're at a moment, I don't want to say it's a moment of crisis, but a moment of decision. There are very many people in this country who do not like what they see happening. They don't like the news on TV. They don't like what they hear from the president. They don't like what they see in the schools. But many of them think, well, what can I do? Well, one thing you can do is link together with other people who agree with you and become more communicating and form small groups. This is what I saw when I was growing up. Small groups of people would decide, no, we don't want segregation. This is how we're going to do it. In Montgomery, they're going to boycott the buses. Well, Tuskegee didn't have any buses, so we boycotted the stores. But these ideas of how you bring about change in a negative, frustrating, and dominating environment are piecemeal. We don't have the whole picture, but we'll have a movement here. Like here, you have this wonderful march I've heard about, the Martin Luther King March. And so that inspires people to think about how your world can change. I don't have a watch, so I don't know how much more time. 5 minutes? We got 5 minutes for questions. Well, let me wrap this up because there's so many people here who would have questions, and my experience is when you start asking questions, there's always somebody at the end of the time, I want to ask, they get the idea. People are shy, but I would be very pleased to be able to conclude the talk by answering questions that people have, that they came with, or questions that came up as they heard me talk. Thank you very, very much. I'm honored to be your Martin Luther King speaker, and I'm delighted to come back to Texas. I was actually born in Texas. I don't tell everybody. My father was on the faculty at Wiley College, and he married my mother, who they met at the University of Michigan, and then she came down to Texas. Now, my mother came from a very professional, her father was a preacher, her mother was a musician, she was a very beautiful singer. She came to Dallas, Texas in the 40s. She was not happy. She would never talk about it. This is what she said: "Those people are uncivilized." Now, one more thing, I'll just tell you, my first memory in life is a memory in Texas. And for the years, I couldn't figure out what this was, and finally now, as an adult, I can put it together. We were in a car. It was a big, boxy Model T type of car in the 1948, probably. My brother was an infant, and he was sick, and my father was driving, and they were rushing to get this baby to a hospital. And I was sitting in the back seat. And all I remember is being on a dark road in this car, and of course it was one-lane highway, one lane this way, one lane that way. And there was not much light. This is 1947, I believe. And the car was stopped. Now, I didn't know at the time. It's taken me many years to figure out why it was stopped. My father was speeding. He was trying to get to a hospital. His son was sick. And a policeman stopped the car. And that's why I remember it. There was an atmosphere of terror inside that car that night. Here's a black man with his family speeding, and he stopped by Highway Patrol, Texas Highway Patrol. Well, we did survive. But that's my first memory. It's very interesting. My first memory in life is being stopped on a dark road in Texas by the Highway Patrol. Did that put me in the mind to join the Black Panther Party? I don't know. But I would love to be able to answer questions, and I think we're just at that time. So thank you very much for inviting me. You're a beautiful crowd. And now we can have questions.
Good evening. First, I would like to thank you for coming to share with us. I am very encouraged by your words. My question, I'm a fellow an educator, and I'm now an administrator, and being a part of the Trinity alumni. I feel as an educator, my job is to invoke thought, innovation, as well as teach students to tap into who they really are, to be able to evoke the change that you're talking about. But based on some of the challenges that were met in this city of San Antonio, as far as many of the areas are divided by income, we're basically, to me, in my personal opinion, segregating schools based on what you have and what you don't have.
Yeah, it's economic segregation.
Right,
It's not
and-
racial segregation.
Right, and so sometimes I feel as an educator that I am giving false hope to some of my students, not in the sense that I'm telling them the wrong thing, but some of the things that are within the city kind of gives them I guess you can say, slams the door in their face to the ideas. So my question is, what advice would you give unto me going forward on how to continue to push my students to knock down those walls, but I guess a lane in which to follow, or steps in which to follow to achieve those things? Because sometimes as people, even myself, I'll say, you can do anything, you can be anything. And then now my famous thing is, well, Donald Trump is president, so you can do anything. And so, but in turn, I don't want to, in me, feel like I am giving them a false sense of hope in certain things.
No, I don't think it's false. What I think you have to be certain about is to give the student confidence. It's not hope. The confidence that what they desire is something that they can work for. If they can persuade other people and they can join with other people to do things, that change is always possible. What was it that Jesse, not that I like him that much, but Jesse used to say all the time? Keep hope alive. To be engaged. The important thing is to be engaged in the process of transforming what you see that you don't like. You might not actually succeed in transforming it, but the act of thinking it through and the act of pulling together people to work together also has a benefit and shows people a process by which social justice can actually materialize eventually. I mean, look at the audience. Look who goes to Texas. Look who goes to Trinity College in 2018. And when was it started? 1896? 1869. Well, there's a big change here. And it's a different kind of university than it was when it was first created. Texas is a different kind of state than it was when I was born here in 1945, which is a good thing. Change does happen. It doesn't happen quickly. It might not happen when you want it to happen, but it does happen. What did Martin Luther King say? The arc of justice bends. It's a long arc, but it bends toward justice.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Good evening. I'm glad to be able to come and hear your speech. I'm a transplanted New Yorker. I've been here, thank you, going on 7 years. I rushed to get here because of my lovely wife, Anna. But I see some of the economic problems that the young lady was just speaking of, and you know, between the east side and the south side, as opposed to what's on the west side and the north side. And you know, those things happen, but there is change, and it's slowly taking place. Encouraged by the present administration in charge here right now in this city. Something I'm wondering about, especially with the last election, is you being a law professor, the possibility of changing the electoral college. Is there hope, or is there any dynamic that could be involved with that we could, because 2 of the last 3 presidents basically got in because of the electoral college, and with the gerrymandering of different voting areas and the amount of congressmen that get in, it seems like the elections are rigged. Right, right.
Well, I think one of the issues is there was a huge fight to get the right to vote for people who were denied the right to vote.
True.
Over my parents' years and my youth, et cetera. So now the voting population is a multiracial multi-ethnic and multi-income level population, which means it's a little harder to pull some of the stunts that they were able to do before.
Okay.
So that means that there's more effort to take you off the voting rolls, change the, to skew the system.
Right.
And the people who are interested in doing that tend to be powerful, and the people for whom it impacts may not even know what's going on, and they may not have the time and energy to pay attention to it. So you have a problem of economic challenges and social injustice that combines, which means you need broader base movements to raise awareness and to raise funds and to gain some sort of spot where you can make a change here. Let's say maybe not all of Texas, but this one little thing. So give people an awareness that you can bring about change. It may be small, but it's important. And it's important to retain the belief and the awareness that the people in this country do have the right to change things, even though it seems like it's almost impossible. But we have that right, and when people really, really, really pull together and under massive stress, like to end the Vietnam War, it does ultimately happen. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't always happen when you want it to happen. But keep hope alive.
Yeah, I've been doing that since the 70s myself.
Yeah.
I'm a Vietnam veteran, so thank you.
Yes, yes.
Hello. On January 20th, it's going to be the anniversary of Trump's inauguration, and on that day, there was some protests in Washington, D.C., and a lot of people got arrested. So there's obviously repression that goes on even today against dissent. A local person in San Antonio was charged with a bunch of crimes for up to 70 years, but he got off, thankfully. He was a photographer. And so I work with the Jericho movement, which actually works with veterans of the movement, of the Black Panthers and other groups, and support them, write them letters. So we're doing a fundraiser on the 20th for both the J20 defendants and for Jericho movement, which again works with. So I just want to say that there still are Black Panthers in prison. There are people who have been in the movement who are still locked up, and so I just wanted to ask, like, what is the importance of supporting those people, political prisoners, and the way that the prison system is used for social control in the United States, like the 13th Amendment, which is basically legalizes slavery in the form of prison in the United States.
It most certainly does. And prison is where some of the former strongest activists of the Black Panther Party are. Some have gotten out of prison, and they're senior citizens now. Prison is one of those horrible, super destructive obstacles that's put in the way to block social change, to maintain the status quo, to maintain the racial hierarchy. And I have several comrades and friends who've either been in prison a long time or are still there, like Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was framed as a teenager in Philadelphia on something he didn't do, and he's still behind bars. That's part of the racial and political injustice that we're subjected to, that people have to take, not necessarily that particular case, but that phenomenon is what we have continually to challenge. Now, it takes a lot of energy if you're just one. You need broad-based coalitions, broad-based groups to change the awareness and help people understand why it's important. And that requires essentially a social justice movement. And I think what's out there is the beginnings of a new social justice movement. It's kind of slow, and it's very disconnected in the sense you might not get the same feeling in Kansas City that you might get in Atlanta or in Texas or whatever, but there's enough of a problem for people, well-meaning people, decent citizens, former activists, and young people to see things need to change. This is not the America, this is not the way we want America to be. There are people who want America to be that way, but they're much richer and they have more power and they are benefiting off the suffering of most of the people. So, my feeling is let's keep up the struggle, resume the struggle, remember the struggle, refresh yourself, reload, and get moving. or get other people moving. We love it.
Sorry, I'm kind of short, so I have to adjust the microphone. I'm actually an alumna of Trinity University, class of 2016. I'm currently getting my master's degree at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And one of the books I read for one of my classes last semester was At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire, which discusses the sexual assault of the late Recy Taylor, but also the contributions of women, especially Black women, to various civil rights movements. So I was just wondering if you could speak on maybe the visibility of women, especially women of color, to various social justice movements. Do you feel there has been a regression or a progression in terms of recognizing their contributions?
I'm not sure, because all the social justice movements that Black people have been in part of had a tremendous amount of women involved in them. Let's just talk about Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Sometimes the woman may be acknowledged. I'm thinking of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which I was a part of, and Ella Baker, who was the woman who helped start it. And she was like the guide and the mother and the encourager. And she was an activist from an earlier generation, and she devoted her energy to assisting and encouraging people who are a lot younger and probably didn't have the good sense that she thought they should, but she didn't condemn us. She wanted to, and she would sit in these meetings and listen to the SNCC people go on and discuss and just listen and be there, be a spirit, be a supporter, and not try and tell these young people what they should do, but give advice. And so I think that's part of the growth of social justice movements, that there needs to be a person from the prior generation engaged to support and to help, but not to tell what to do. Your generation has to figure out what to do and how to do it. And young people are innovative, and they come up with ideas that no one else ever heard of. Who came up with the sit-ins? Just go and we're going to sit in for segregation. Okay, this says whites here, black. No, we're going to sit in the white seats. All right. So this was just a thing that people started doing, and then it caught on. And ultimately segregation became illegal. But so use your imagination, use your energy, do what you think you can, and pull other people with you. That's how organizers think. Everyone is not an organizer, but everyone can participate in organized challenges to justice if that's what they are willing to do.
Thank you.
I'm going to go here. Yes.
I don't know, Ms. Cleaver. Yeah, my question is, your generation when you were active with the Black Panther Party is similar to today in the sense of the struggles that you were fighting against back then with racism, economic depression, and militarism. We're still seeing it today. However, your group or your era, your generation of that era, had a more internationalist minded, particularly the Black Panther Party, who made the link between the long war in Vietnam, with what was happening in the streets of America. It seems today that social groups does not make that link. We have enough forever war now, just like back then. But it seems like the linkage are not being made like your generation made it.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Then.
Why do you think those linkages aren't being made?
I'm asking your thoughts.
Pardon?
I'm asking your thoughts on it.
Well, part of it has to do with the media. The media is much more dominant now than it was then. I mean, when the Vietnam War was going on, there might have been 4 or 5 television channels, and people watched pretty much the same thing. The newspapers weren't as censored as they seem to be now, because it wasn't as costly. And there was in my opinion, communities were more intact. Parents, 2 parents and children living in one place, that was the norm, which is not necessarily now. And the economy the cost of living was much lower. Therefore, the people who could afford to have a family and also, or have a marriage and also protest, was a broader group because it didn't cost that much to live. If you can rent a house, let's say in Atlanta, apartment in Atlanta, and you have to pay, I don't know, $200 rent, well, if 4 people live in there and everybody can contribute, it's inexpensive. The rent isn't expensive, so you can have time from work and also to struggle. Everything is so expensive now, it's very complex to figure out, well, how can you work, support yourself, and then contribute to a movement? That's very complex. So you need more collective thinking and more devices of struggle and survival of struggle that we didn't have. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to use your imagination a lot more and perhaps engage more people. I know there's a group of people whose activism is funded by organizations, and what they end up doing is going out writing grants and explaining what they want to do and submit the grant, and then they get the money. And by the time they've conditioned to what they want to do to the ability to get a grant, it's not exactly what they had in mind. And so funding is a huge constraint to how can people stay engaged and struggle when they need to work or when they need to raise money for their organization. So if you look at the structure of the nonprofit world and the things that you have to do to exist as a nonprofit and the commitment you have to make, et cetera, after a while it's gonna, you might spend up more of your time writing grants to get money for your organization than your organization even doing anything. And so it's a different economic and political structure that's more suppressive, in my opinion, of social justice activism than the one I was part of back in the 60s and 70s. That doesn't mean it can't be done, that just means it's harder.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for spending time with us tonight. This is a question about how we commemorate Martin Luther King. It's really hard. It's been a digging question at me for a long time. Growing up in Memphis, a city that really understands the legacy of Martin Luther King, but then also getting involved with really radical organizers in Memphis who are critical of the way that this country commemorates one figure as opposed to the movement as a whole. Do you think there's any danger in placing such an elevated sort of like elevating one person in place of this movement? Do you think it sends a message like broadly, not anything like, you know, because obviously there's many people that understand the many people that went into the civil rights movement and the way that movements happen, but do you think broadly it sends the wrong message generally to society that there will be somebody who comes along and sort of helps the movement go like a savior or something like that, even though it's made of many people in reality?
Well, you're talking about the real world, and then this raising of one figure to great prominence, such as Martin Luther King. Part of that is because he was murdered so young. It was a shock, and it was wrong, and everybody knows it, and so that's one person you can focus on. There were other people who were murdered too, lots of other people, but they're not the figurehead, or they're not the mobilization, they're not the inspiration for movements. I think the base of movement struggle, the base of social justice is large numbers of people who contribute small amounts of time. Otherwise, you have something that's highly unstable. Small numbers of people who contribute huge amounts of time, and then they burn out. And I'm sure many of you have been in those kind of organizations. But there's something about building an awareness and a consensus of where the changes that are most important need to be made. And I think when Martin Luther King was alive, he was in the position to help that process along. In fact, I think he helped it along a little bit too much as far as the larger state was concerned, because they murdered him, assassinated him. And it wasn't the first. They had this plan, several, from the material I've read, there were several attempts and several plans to eliminate him, and the one that succeeded was the one in Memphis. But there were prior plans in the works to get rid of him, because one of the reasons I think it was because he was a preacher, because the things he said were acceptable to very large numbers of people, and they were true. You know, he didn't make anything up. So that made him threatening, and he knew it himself. I mean, when you hear his last speeches, you know, how can I justify counseling young men who are going to Vietnam to be nonviolent when the United States is the most violent country in the world. So he was articulating contradictions that were problematic, and he did it in such a clear, unmistakable way that he was targeted. It took them a while. If you read about his life and read books about it, you'll see that there were other attempts. There were more than one attempt to kill him. And the last one succeeded. But he knew what he was risking, and a lot of other people did, and everybody's not willing to take that kind of chance. And I think once they see what happened to King, and they see that this is real, you know, the threat of death and the threat of assassination can be real, people back off. Or they do something else. They become more, what's the right word, acceptable.
Thank you very much.
Is it up? Okay.
So there's time for a question from this mic.
And that mic.
I'm sorry for the rest of you in the aisle, but there won't be time for all the questions. And then we'll end with the question here. And so
With the one that says Jordan?
The one that says Jordan.
Yeah, that's the last question. Okay.
Thank you.
So what I'm wondering about is what do you think about trying to increase the intersectionality between different social struggles and movements? Because like I hear, you know, ugly racist things coming from people that I know are poor and white about people who are poor and black, and people who are poor and black saying ugly racist things about people who are poor and Mexican. And I was president of my Gay Straight Alliance at my college, and I heard gay men saying really disparaging things about transgender people, and all I can see is we're struggling against each other rather than uniting to bring all of our power together, which I think if we could all get on the same page, could actually be more powerful than the status quo and the powers that be.
You're right, if you could all get on the same page. So just think about it from the other angle. Why are not people on the same page? I mean, they can justify this themselves, and so that's one of the obstacles to movement building in the United States, is that certain groups have their issues and other groups have their, and they don't really want to sort of sacrifice part of their issue to collaborate. I think it could be, I'm not sure, but it could be the threat is not as frightening as it would be that make all people want to huddle together. And also, America has a tradition of individualism, like, well, this is our issue. We're going to do this. You can do that. And so the people who are opposed to social justice encourage this kind of thing. Well, you don't want to work with those people. You know, what does the Chinese struggle have to do with what you want? So the effort is to divide and weaken social justice movements. It was King was actually amazing in that he enabled, or people who followed him had a lot of different ideas, but he enabled a larger collection of people, and I think it may be because he was a pastor, because he was trained to be the uniter. And he had brilliant oratorical skills, and he actually believed in the justice that he was seeking, and he knew that he was going to pay for it with his life. He knew that. They let him know. I mean, he was sent letter bombs, he was sent death threats, he knew at some point that he was a target and that was going to work. And so, but he didn't stop. So I think that's one of the great things about King, is that it's not that he was so brave, but that he was so sincere. He knew what had to be done, and he saw his work as a work of God. And he knew what was going to happen to him.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last question?
Thank you for coming to speak today. I'm unaware of your sentiments regarding recent progressive social movements, but if you were to consider modern liberalism as a measure of receding freedom, or a consistent measure of receding freedom, and the potential adverse effects of modern liberalism, how would recent progressive social movements such as Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street differ if they were placed within the context of the civil rights movement?
Well, they're a little bit more sophisticated in the sense that their goals are not as broadly understood as people who say, we want the right to vote. We want an end to segregation. These are broad things that everybody can understand. Black Lives Matter has agendas and things that they want to accomplish, but it's not as easily understood as we're boycotting the buses because you're segregating black people, okay? So I think there's a, what's the right word? More of a niche type movement than a general broad spread across the board challenge to social and racial injustice. That's what I see. And that it probably takes 50 years to build up something like that. I happened to be a young person when that movement had reached its crest. So we were like, and also the Vietnam War pretty much set off a whole nother level of opposition to social injustice. And the fact that there were so many young men who were veterans who didn't want to go, and so we were in and this is the same time of King, we were in a moment of crisis as a country. And, well, like, there was one saying, said, if I have to die in Vietnam, so I don't want to go and die in Vietnam in a rice paddy. If I have to die, I want to die here fighting for justice in America. That was the attitude that some young men took. I don't think that's an attitude that they have now. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a student who's really begging for one more question. Will you
Is
take
that the
one
girl?
more? Yes.
Of course.
Okay. Hi. I have this question, and it's been burning my mind for quite a while. So as I've been learning a lot about Black Panther Party...
Don't talk so fast. I
I'm
can't
sorry.
hardly hear what you're saying.
I'm so sorry. I'm nervous. As I've been learning a lot about like the Black Panther Party and kind of being a Black woman in activism, how do you feel that like women of color, specifically Black women, should navigate organizations or activist movements where they're often dismissed or discriminated against, even organizations such as like the Black Panther Party, who like later on we've learned that they've said certain things about women, or specifically like darker skinned women.
I was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party. I didn't do any of that. They did that after I left.
Yeah. But how do you tell like women of color, especially Black women, like how do we kind of like work with them, but knowing that they still participate in aspects of oppression that lead us to still be in the same position while they get to be free?
Who is it they? Who is it they? Your question is very complex. Could you repeat it and make it more clear?
I wrote it down. So, basically what I said is, how do women of color navigate their work when they're often dismissed, discriminated against in organizations that claim to be freedom for all, but yet participate in aspects that oppress them, like as they're
That's an
working.
eternal question. I mean, I'm sure that was true of the Black women leaders in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks was discriminated against. Ella Baker was discriminated. They just rolled with it and did it anyway.
Right.
They were very strong characters, and they gained respect. Now, everybody can't do that, but also it's important to challenge this kind of sexist discrimination or sexist, well, it's not discrimination as much as you are less than.
Right.
But this is, how would I put it? This is part of the way in the American culture, capitalist, monetary-oriented culture, this is a way of sabotaging, and I don't even know if it's conscious, it's sabotaging social justice. To like, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about those other people? And so you get hung up in arguing over things that you already know about instead of actually challenging what the problem is. And that's a tactic. It's a tactic of delay and a tactic of confusion, and people fall for it all the time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Please join me for a final round of applause for Kathleen Cleaver.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.